Dude, I feel like we're coming full circle here. I feel like I was very inspired by your podcast, and you have been a huge inspiration for me to start my own podcast. So I welcome you, Danny, to the show.
Dude, I just want to say thank you for being here, and thank you for saying that in the kind words, and I'm grateful that my podcast has played some role in.
Yeah, of course, man. Yeah, so I want to start off with your blog at 13 years old because I think that's a good starting point. And I think you tweeted a few weeks ago, 8 simple steps to be happier. And I'll read a little bit. So, while we constantly become more entangled with technology, we become farther and farther from our hearts. What we feel is starting to slime down an easy path. The mass majority of our emotions are coming from outsourced materials. This has to change. Like you were 13 at the time, so like where did that sense of awareness and that insight come about?
I don't know, is the truthful answer. I don't know where it came about. I don't know where it came from. Um, I know that I was raised with a loving family. I know that I was raised with a deep interest in reading and learning. Zen Habits was one of my favorite blogs at that time. And I remember just having a deep knowing within myself how important it was for me to write on the internet. And if I look at my life almost 16 years later, I can see the through line is absolutely there. And this understanding of writing and this want to write and share my message was so important to me. And the message I'm preaching in that blog post was you can be happy right now and you have everything within yourself, even if you have the most horrific circumstances, you can choose peace.
Mm,
And that's yeah, that was it's part of my soul. It's part of my soul to put that out there.
dude, that's wonderful because it's pretty wild, now 16 years later, you're kind of doing the things that kind of reflect from what you wrote back when you were 13, with the retreats, the community groups, the coaching, everything that you're doing, it kind of goes hand to hand, back from the parallels. So I guess the childhood stuff really leaves clues. And I imagine, was there like a moment, back in your childhood, maybe like high school or college, where you felt like, oh, maybe I'm on to something that I might be a little bit different from most of my peers? Was there like any experiences like that?
Yeah, well, when I was 15, I started a Knicks blog, a New York Knicks blog,
Yeah.
and circumstances had me end up interviewing the New York Knicks, the NBA players that I admired. And when I showed up to interview them, the reporters who were in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s were in shock that this 15-year-old was in front of them, that this 15-year-old was interviewing NBA players. And a couple of newspapers, Newsday and New York Daily News, wrote about me because of this. And so you can't experience a situation like that and not believe you're different in some way because you quite literally are being reflected as so different that people are commenting on just the way you are, and they are acknowledging it to more humans. And
Mm,
so being different always was part of my an understanding since that real moment at 15. I knew 13 it was odd to start a blog on how to be happier. I knew
yeah.
that intellectually, but
Mhm.
the external reflection of that was really more pronounced at 15.
Yeah, I see. And I guess like with what you're doing right now, I feel like a lot of people like hear these buzzwords, with consciousness, God, light,
Mm.
truth. So I think we can kind of, before we dive into all of that, could we kind of go back to how you define these buzzwords? Like how would you define consciousness?
Consciousness is awareness,
Mm,
and consciousness is the what's behind your eyes.
mm,
The awareness that is behind your eyes at all times. That to me is consciousness. What leaves your body when you die? That to me is consciousness. And um, consciousness to me is the seer behind it all.
mm. And you mentioned, you've been a big fan of David Hawkins' work, The Map of Consciousness Explained. And in a podcast episode, you were saying how the map of consciousness is not a ladder but a circle, right? And it seems
Mm.
like sometimes we suppress these lower states as if the higher states are better than the lower states, but you suggest no, we have to kind of feel everything from all spectrums. So could you kind of describe why you believe it's a circle?
Sure. So the map of consciousness is basically a map created by David Hawkins that from the bottom is emotions like grief, shame, guilt, anger, and to the top is emotions like peace, love, enlightenment. Um, and the idea of it being a circle was first introduced to me by my friend L and I think my friend Tej both had this idea of it being a circle. And the idea is basically if you want to feel a state of love, you need to look at the places that give you pain, that give you grief, that give you sadness, that make you feel not love. And this is not something you do once. This is something you might have to do 10 times in a given day of to understand where do I feel the most guilt? Where do I feel shame? Why do I feel guilt if I walk through a grocery store? Maybe it's because when you went through a grocery store when you were young, you shoplifted and you stole some things. And so you walk into the grocery store, you feel guilt or you feel shame, and then it's up to you to find a place of peace and love and forgiveness for yourself for doing what you did and recognizing and connecting the guilt and shame that you feel to that situation to then supersede that and realize that you are not actually the 7-year-old. You just experienced what the 7-year-old did in that moment, and that you can find a level of peace for what you did and realize that you don't want to do that again.
Oh, that's really beautifully said. I remember, you had a podcast episode with Tej, and you were saying, but we want to feel the lights, so to speak. We don't kind of go up to the light, but we go down to the darkness and shine light to the places that we feel the most dark. Maybe, the lower states like guilt, shame, emotion. So I think you touched on a brilliant point here.
Thank you. I appreciate you
Yeah.
saying that. And I feel that it makes sense, right?
Mm.
It it makes sense that if you want to feel light, you have to understand every place you feel dark and shine light on it. Of course, that makes sense. And the practical example is going to the grocery store. The practical example is every place that you feel yourself get angry. Why? What's going on? What is happening when somebody cuts you off in traffic? What wound of yours is that um, triggering in that moment?
Mm.
And that that is the work that I aim to do with myself, with others, with in all moments that I possibly can.
Yeah, beautiful. And I think you also briefly touched upon, the topic of death because I feel like it's a very, deep subject. And you
Hmm.
mentioned how consciousness can transcend death. And I remember you were interviewing Mike Posner and he was saying how death is just a rebirth.
Yeah.
And do you see death as the same way? And do you see like our consciousness living on beyond our physical death?
Yes and yes. Um, if you look at it from the perspective of our human life, we
Yeah,
know that every time we die in our own human life, meaning like when you graduate college, that's a death of sorts.
yeah,
And when you go through a breakup, that's a death of sorts. And we know that every time we die, we transform and we become a different version of ourselves if we let ourselves.
yeah.
And a rebirth that is potentially greater than the version of ourselves that existed before. So we know that from the human form. We accept that completely wholly. And so what I've been doing over the past month or two is going deep on near death experiences and people who have gone to the other side or been given the option to go to the other side and see what they have to say. I mean, if it is true, then we should look at those situations. We should analyze them. We should ask ourselves questions around them. And I'm fascinated by it. And what seems to be the case from Anita Morjani to Vincent Tolman is a sense of you go out of your body, and especially in the cases, I guess, of near death experiences where someone's on the brink,
Yeah.
they go out of their body and they're observing the scene. and being able to observe the scene from the top corner of the room and be able to tell people what they said and what they did during those situations while their
Wow.
consciousness is out of their body.
Wow.
Wow is right.
Yeah.
It's like the lessons that they learn on the other side are lessons of love, of peace, of unity, of connection. And they were both given the opportunity to go to the other side or to stay. And they both chose to stay in their bodies. And they saw how people working on them, how they some of them in both situations, they could show and they could say which paramedics who worked on them were wanting to give up on them versus wanting to keep them alive. And
Yeah.
if you just let that sit in, what does that mean? Right? What does that mean that they could experience
Yeah.
consciousness while not in their body? And it's a beautiful thing. I highly recommend Dying to Be Me, the book, and The Light After Death, two incredible reads. And um, yeah, very fascinated by that topic.
Beautiful. Yeah. Who is God to you? Because I feel like the word God gets thrown around a lot, and
Mm.
it can come up in many different religions. But do you believe believe in some like objective God that we're all living in this beautiful creation of God right now?
Yeah. Yeah, I think God is, uh, firstly, the same force that creates the ocean is inside of you. And so you and me, we're both parts of God.
Yeah.
And to me, God is a couple of things. God is what is and what has been. It's undeniable that yesterday you experienced some events,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
Because you're here right now. So what you experienced is part of God and is God's creation. And trying to fight that is fighting God.
Wow. Profound.
And God
Yeah.
God is love. Really at the simplest way to explain it. God is the and what is love? Love is the connection between things. And so can you connect with all things that have been and that currently are?
Wow. That's a great question.
Right?
Yeah.
And that is
Yeah.
loving God.
Hmm.
And that helps you connect with all things that will be. If you can connect with what has been and what is, you are with the same force that is creating what will be.
Wow. So connect the past and the present, and you will connect with the future.
Correct.
Wow. Yeah. I know David Perel asked you this question. Who do you worship? I think
Mm.
last time you answered it, it's like I worship my guests as a podcast host. Has
Yeah.
yeah, has that changed at all? And like if so, like who do you worship right now? Or what do you worship?
I think I worship the divine inside myself.
Hmm.
I worship the same force that is um has created the oceans and creates the grass. And it's like I don't actually in this current moment believe that God wants us to worship God.
Hmm.
I believe God wants us to worship the God within ourselves. That's my current belief.
Ooh. I guess on a similar note, like how do you define living in truth? Like what do you believe that the truth that we're all seeking is?
Love, peace, joy, um, being authentic, being real, showing when we're not in love, peace, or joy, um, being kind to other people, loving one another, being saying the thing that is difficult to say, um, following our true life path. silence,
Yeah.
nature. That's what I think we're seeking.
Mm. Yeah, and I feel like, with all the meditation that you've done in the past years, I feel like that's like one of like the really good ways we can tap into that truth, seeking solitude, seeking nature, and then just looking inward to find, that truth within us. So yeah, that's really nice. And one question I have is, we're living in 2024, and it's wild because when we think about it, we could have been born in the 6th century, the
Hmm.
17th century, any other time period, but we're here now in 2024. And what do you believe about, I guess, this era, so to speak, that makes it such a special era of humanity and of all the past, decades, eras that we could have existed?
If you if you say that God is love and love is connection,
Mhm.
we are connecting for the first time in human history with one another through technology.
Hmm. It's true.
And if you really sit with that, it is the first time that a person in New York could talk to somebody in Australia instantaneously through forces that we've created. And that is a pretty remarkable thing. And that's what makes this time so special is the connection that's possible through man-made devices. I think the widespread use of that makes it a really special time.
Mhm. And I think you also mentioned, there's a whole like reawakening of consciousness, and I guess you could say that's happening in Austin right now. And could you kind of briefly describe like what you're seeing within like the energy flows of the world right now as we speak?
I hosted a meditation at my place here today, this weekend rather,
Yeah.
and there was 14 people here, including myself,
Mm.
and everyone had the same feeling afterwards, which was like, I feel amazing. I feel so full of love in this moment. I feel held with love. I feel buoyed, is what some people said after the
Yeah.
meditation was over. And if I would just were to sit back and relax and think about it, I don't know where else I could go where hosting a group meditation would be so normal and so accepted and so part of the culture as Austin, Texas. I'm sure people do it in San Francisco. I'm sure people do it in New York. I'm sure people do it all across the country in Sedona and Florida and Kansas and Idaho. And I'm sure people do it. But for it to be part of the culture and the way of being is what makes Austin different. In that I could go to a walk in the morning where people are spreading joy and love, and I could end up with 13, 14 human beings in my apartment, and we could just meditate and be
Yeah.
one with all that is. And to me, it's unlike anything I've experienced. And so the amount of joy, the people living in joy, the connection, the everybody wanting to live in truth, and everybody wanting to make money from the thing that they are most alive by. Isn't it really interesting, Justin, how what we do, how we make our money is we've somehow, for most people, divorced it from what makes us feel alive.
Mm.
And there's some level of inauthenticity that is going on when that occurs. If you don't support the thing that you are doing to make money, but you're living a different life that's making you feel alive when you get off work, then how could you actually be worshiping the divine within yourself?
Ooh.
And so what I think is being created in Austin is people who are aligning their truth with how they're getting paid. And when you solve for that, that is um, that's a very big part of one's waking hours.
Mm.
And a lot of people are solving that here in Austin. So
Wow.
special.
Yeah, I have a question. Like, have you ever felt that misalignment between, you getting paid and doing some work that pays some money versus like you now living in alignment between what you get paid and like what makes you feel alive? Like what differences do you notice? I imagine like it must be like a huge shift, 180-degree shift.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
always I've been pretty attuned to my own body and mind. Sometimes I act on that attunement and sometimes I don't. And, for example, in college, I was partying a lot. And I would say that for most of my time, I was not aligning what I was doing with my time with what I actually enjoyed because I didn't know. But I was attuned to the idea that it was not right. And it was causing me to, it looking back, it was causing me to drink and party. And um, when I think about what happened after college was I started to ask myself, what's the way I can make money the fastest and the easiest? And I came across this thing called drop shipping.
Yeah.
And drop shipping what played an important role in my life in that time, but it was just so that I could make money. And it was just so that I could feel um, safety and security. And I did this for a year. And then at the end of that year that I was doing it, I felt like something was wrong. Something was deeply, deeply wrong.
Mm.
And that feeling of a lack of alignment really caused me to sit with myself and really forced me to meditate. And it made me vow, you can never do this again. You can never have this deep of a misalignment between what you actually enjoy and how you are making money.
Mm.
And so I stopped that immediately after having some savings and started to become a personal trainer. And instantly I noticed that this was so different. I was making people feel healthier. I was making people feel happier. I was improving their day. This was more closely aligned with the things that I naturally cared about. It wasn't the final picture, as what I'm sure I'm doing right now is not the final picture, but what was happening was I was getting closer and closer, starting with the personal training.
I imagine like when we want to align those two things together, I imagine there's a lot of surrendering we have to do with ourselves, a
Yeah.
process of letting go what isn't actually us. And that could be like it can be a challenging thing to do. And it takes, a lot of guts and courage to do so. And did you also feel that way when you're kind of transitioning from, making a lot of money during like drop shipping and then doing that podcast and all that? Like, how was that?
Yeah, I would say that on the outside it might have seemed difficult and courageous
Yeah.
and to me on the inside it was I could not settle for anything less than a life that was going to give me fulfillment. And so it was actually the easiest thing in the world. And
Mm-hmm.
um, I wasn't going to compromise that. And so often when we're thinking about growth and we're thinking about becoming a different person, we are trained to believe that we need to do this heroic feat of becoming a different person and struggling and doing the difficult thing in the face of what we were once doing. And I'm here to say that it was actually really easy to be a personal trainer. It was so much more obvious and so much more aligned. It was very easy to go from podcast to go from personal training to podcast. And it was easy for me to go from podcast to coach. It
Wow.
wasn't a difficult thing. It seems difficult to everyone else, but on the inside, it's so right because I'm not valuing somebody else's perspective of my life over me, and I'm not attached to the idea of being a coach. Just like I wasn't attached to the idea of being a podcaster, just like I wasn't attached to the idea of being a personal trainer, just like I wasn't attached to the idea of being a drop shipper.
Oh, that's profound, man. That's like the paradox, Sometimes we think that it takes such great acts of courage to surrender to and change something else, but might be the easiest thing you can do.
It
But
likely is
yeah.
if you're really paying attention.
Hmm.
It might be difficult to the people around you who now have to adjust their perception of you to this new character.
Yeah.
Wait, what do you mean you're personal training? You were just making money dropshipping. What do you mean you're podcasting? You're just personal training. What do you mean you're podcasting? You're and so on and on it goes. And can you just be what is doing the most fulfillment for you and living in what is the most fulfillment for you, regardless of if it makes sense to anyone else or anyone else understands it. That's the question.
Yeah. And I want to pivot, on how you came to find God, because I think you wrote a little essay on online, and I think there was one quote that really resonated with me, which was, I talked to Brent Rashore for the podcast, and he advised me to get on my knees and pray. I did as
Yeah.
he said. I cried, and if you wouldn't mind telling everyone, like, how did you feel at that time? Like, what were the emotions that were running through you?
I don't remember. I don't remember the feelings. I don't remember why I cried. I don't have a journal of it. I wish I did. I wish I recorded a video after it and had it for myself. I wish I um, journaled about it, but I don't know why I cried. I just know that it felt true and it felt right, and it felt like a new person was being formed. And this is kind of what opened me up to the idea of God and God in general is because I could feel how true it was when I went to church and I cried. I had never cried for 15 minutes after going to a lecture before. I never cried for
Yeah.
15 minutes before going to a workout class.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't like I was trying to cry. It wasn't like I was trying not to cry. It just happened. And I looked at that and thought that was pretty remarkable. That in both situations, when I was praying to God, when I went to church, I cried. It's like, okay, there's something there. There's some truth there. There's some wisdom there that is infused in your being. So pay attention.
Mm. Do you think we can intellectualize our way to truth, or do you think it has to do with tapping into our emotions and being in silence?
I think we can absolutely intellectualize our way to truth.
Mm.
And I think there's absolutely a way to, I mean, Brent Bashore, for example, has a document
Yeah.
of I it must be 100 pages of why
Oh,
Jesus actually existed.
wow.
And he's done the arguments for and against, and he's come for this is real, this happened. And
Mm.
so that is intellectualizing your way to truth.
Yeah.
And that's great. You can absolutely do that. You can also intellectualize, you can also drop that if you'd like
Hmm.
and just be in this present moment and figure out what comes up within you and why you feel uncomfortable in these moments or and you could just sit in silence and you could be in truth and there's a million ways to get there, right? There's no one path.
Yeah. Everyone's like spiritual journey is it's all different, and I think that's what I find like so remarkable. Hearing everyone's stories is just mind-boggling to see how everyone has these experiences that they go through in their life that just gets them closer to God, and it's just so remarkable to hear about them.
Yeah,
Just
it's really
just like with your
special.
story. Yeah.
Thank you. What's your story with it?
Mm, and I've been a huge intellectualizer, but then recently it's like, I started feeling more things. And like right now, like my predominant state is wonder. Like I feel so much wonder about the world. And part of me thinks it's like, is this like a spiritual sense of wonder? It's like, what is this? Like I'm feeling so amazing. Like I love life. Life is amazing. Like where am I getting like this headspace from? And I think now it's like kind of more on a more emotional side. And I think I used to be like I used to suppress my emotions, and now I'm just unleashing it all out, and I'm just seeing where it takes me. So
How does that feel for you?
I think the freest I've ever felt in my entire life.
Mm,
Yeah, and I wonder if you're feeling this way as well.
definitely. Yeah, definitely. When you look at your emotions, when you become comfortable with the situations that made you once uncomfortable, how could you not feel more free?
Mm. Yeah, it's like once you release the emotional burden, it's like,
So much comes out. That's what the tears probably were.
yeah.
For me, it's like permission to release whatever emotions were being stored up in those moments.
Mhm. And I also wanted to ask, with the coaching and the retreats that you do nowadays, I remember, your friend Talia, she would ask this question. It's like, what did you lack the most as a child that you have, the most capacity to give right now? And what would your answer to that be?
My answer to that is emotional guidance from a masculine role model.
Mm,
And I'd never felt I had permission to share my emotions, even if I don't know if this was true or not, but this is just how I felt. I felt that I didn't have a place to share my emotions. I didn't have a place to be truthful with what was the deepest parts of myself. I didn't feel I had um, a place to go with my emotions to a man. And so that was what I felt like I lacked.
mm. Do you believe like today's culture is like we kind of stamp down emotions, especially for men? And do you believe
Yeah,
that you're kind of bringing that to the table?
definitely. And I feel
Mm,
like it was even more pronounced 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And I think emotions are becoming more and more open and accepted. And, I was watching a Sopranos, uh, it was a casting tape for Tony Soprano. And in the in the tape he's and in the script, Tony Soprano's talking about how it it doesn't make sense for him to share his emotions. And he doesn't sharing your emotions is wrong or bad, and that's not being a real man. And I have a lot of empathy and understanding for that perspective since I certainly lived with that perspective for a long time because that was the perspective that was passed down to me. And I have a lot of empathy for living that way, but it just doesn't resonate anymore. And I feel there's this shift going on where it's not resonating with men more and more. And
mm.
that's a beautiful thing to witness because it means that men can be more free to be their most truthful selves.
Yeah. And as you know, as you mentioned that you're kind of like the emotional guider of sorts. I want to ask like how do you hold space for other people? Because I know you've done hundreds and hundreds of podcast episodes, you've done coaching calls. Like how does the process of holding space for other person actually mean and holding that presence?
I think it's really about the amount of space that you can hold within yourself. So if you get triggered when somebody um, shares a moment about their own upbringing,
Mhm.
something in you arises of, oh no, like I don't want him to talk about that, then you no longer can hold space for that person because you're now in your own world. You're thinking about yourself. And so holding space is related to how much space you've created within yourself.
Well,
Does that make sense?
so like I guess your capacity for for your I guess your capacity to love yourself is a reflection of how you the capacity you have to love others.
Correct. And when you look at it very practically, if going to a grocery store triggers you and somebody brings up that they went to a grocery store, you're no longer
Yeah.
thinking about that other person and you can't be there for the other person because you're with yourself.
Mm. Oh, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Love
I
to hear
guess
that.
yeah, I guess maybe on like the podcast perspective, like what differences have you noticed, being a host versus being a guest?
Mm. Um, in being a host, it is you're creating the space, you're creating the energy, you're creating the vibe. When you're a guest, you are tuning into the host frequency. You're tuning into what do they care about? What does their audience potentially care about? How can I be more useful and serve in this situation? Uh, and I think they're both coming for me. How I did it was I was trying to both come from a place of service, but it was I felt like the preparation I needed to do as the host was more pronounced and was more and then it kind of dropped after understanding myself better and realized I didn't need to prepare at all. And I think it's cultivating your home versus going to somebody's home. I think that's the difference.
Well, that's a nice analogy. Yeah, and I think
Yeah.
on the topic, I guess related to both coaching and podcasting, sometimes we don't know where the conversation will lead to,
Yeah.
and how do you tune in more to that frequency of what the other person is saying? And how do you have, have you had the presence to ask the best, I guess, question to kind of poke deeper into whatever that person is might be saying?
Yeah. So when we speak, there's so many things going on.
Yeah.
And when you're speaking to someone in person, you have access to so much information that the person who's speaking is not just saying what they're saying. They're saying often their entire history and is coming through in the way they're holding their body, in in the ways they stop speaking at certain moments. And there's an energy behind what they're saying and why. And so what I've done over 400 plus podcast episodes and hundreds of coaching sessions is I've gotten better at learning the patterns that people pick up and what they're actually saying behind what they're saying. And so that is that's really special to be able to witness and to be able to see the conversation that's happening behind the conversation.
Mm, that's really nice. Yeah, and I think there's some tweets that you wrote that were pretty banger, and I would like to, have you maybe talk a little bit deeper about it. And I think one of them is when you hold a position with harshness, ask yourself, what am I not willing to feel? Could you kind of
Yeah.
describe that?
Yeah. I'm trying to think of the last position I held with harshness. I just kind of noticed the pattern in people I was speaking to of we hold that position of harshness as a way to protect ourselves, as a way to not feel empathy for that situation, the other person. And it's likely because we felt like we didn't have permission to feel love for ourselves or the other person in that moment. And the harshness is the indicator of that we are not going with God, that we are not going with truth, that we are not going with love. Because if there was love for that situation, it wouldn't be harsh. We wouldn't have it, there wouldn't be any sense that something is wrong. Everything is right.
Mm,
And so that's that's kind of why the tweet came to be.
yeah. And I feel like when we hold ourselves, to some degree of harshness, I imagine like I know I've experienced as well, but like we have this, maybe like psychological block, maybe that we want to be vulnerable, but we hold ourselves back. Like have you overcome that in a similar sense? And like how did you kind of get over that from like that blockade to that moment of vulnerableness?
Yeah, so I'll give you a practical example. Um, I remember uh, succeeding with drop shipping
Yeah.
and tweeting out or maybe posting on Instagram like something along the lines of "fuck having a 9 to 5,"
Mm,
and that's a waste of your time. And that was a particular position that I held with harshness in that moment, and that I have a lot of empathy for. Because where does that come from? That feeling of fuck a 9 to 5 comes from me wanting to prove that I could make money without having a 9 to 5 job. And it came from this perspective of anger towards the system that was getting me down and anger towards anyone who would be a part of that system.
mhm,
Um, how I got over that was I saw that there are people who are really happy who have a 9 to 5 job. That having a 9 to 5 job doesn't is not anything wrong with someone who has a 9 to 5 job, and unless they themselves feel like it's not living an authentic life to them. And what I wasn't willing to feel was empathy for people who actually do have 9 to 5 jobs and for the system as a whole. And what does that process look like? It looks like sitting with the harsh perspective and inviting more love into it. and asking, how could I love this situation, this person, this statement 10% more? What does that look like? So,
Mm. Yeah, it seems like sometimes we cast our judgment on things that we don't deem as inauthentic, but might be authentic to other people.
right.
Yeah, I think that's something, to, I guess as we live our lives to consider, where am I casting our judgment? Where am I casting harshness towards? And how can I, shine light and like shine empathy on that matter?
Yeah, it's the most important thing I think we can do because there's a version of me that is saying fuck a 9 to 5 and being um, angry towards 9 to 5 jobs for the rest of my life. But that's stopping me from growing. That's stopping
Yeah,
me from being the truest version of myself who can embrace and love all people for their decisions.
yeah. And I think maybe going back on the topic of money, because I think it was Tej Doso who said, making money is as easy as making a cup of coffee.
Hmm.
And like from what you're doing right now, do you see that to be true? And I feel like sometimes when we try to align ourselves with, what we get paid for with and what makes us feel most alive, we might feel this roadblock where there's no way I can actually make money from doing that. And what do you have to say to those people?
Think about how powerful you are. You created a reality where you cannot make money doing what you love because you say to yourself, I no, there's no way I could do that. Like that's how powerful and strong you are. And you create that reality of
But
it's
then,
actually really difficult.
yeah.
Uh, I had a client I worked with who had this block of making money while doing enjoyable things just wouldn't click. It wouldn't it it was like putting it was very difficult for him to make money doing things that he enjoyed because he grew up thinking that making money had to be difficult. And doing what you enjoy doesn't mean making money in any way. And so I basically had him um start. I mean, before that block came about, there was a block about um I actually don't want to go into his specific scenario and story,
Yeah, no
but
worries.
but I will say that to be held and loved in that scenario of okay, you think this is impossible. You think it's impossible to make money doing something you love, or you are not willing to want this to be reality. Okay, let's make $10 this weekend doing something we love. Let's make $100 this weekend doing something we love. And what is something that I genuinely would do because it's enjoyable for me? And how can I find an example of somebody making money from doing this? Right? There are things that we all like to do, and there are people who get paid for doing those things. So let's look at that. I mean, a great example is from Wayne Dyer, who sat next to a woman on the plane. And the woman, he asked the woman what she does, and she said she's a photographer.
Yeah.
And Wayne asks, well, do you enjoy being a photographer? And she says, yeah, I love it, but I can never get rich doing it. And he says to her, yeah, with that attitude, you're absolutely right. You are correct. You will never be rich doing
Yeah.
being a photographer. If you look at photographers, there many make a lot of money. But what's the difference between those who make money and those who don't with photography? Likely one thing is a belief that they can make money from being a photographer. And so often the beliefs in our head are shaping our reality. And so often we have she was told or she believed that photography was not something she could make money doing and or at least be rich doing. And of course that's not true, but of course that is what she believed and that's what she created.
Yeah. It's wild, like how powerful we are, like how just like even our subconscious beliefs could just shape the reality and we wouldn't even know about it. So I think that is, I guess, just a testament to know, to see like how the human mind, whatever we conceive of, determines our reality. It's pretty remarkable if you really think about it.
And what if you allowed yourself to live with as much joy as was possible? What if it was possible to live with as much love and as much gratitude and if lived in every state of receiving money and being grateful and seeing that the power you had was within you and not within anything else.
Yeah, that's a
It's
question to think about.
possible.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Let's wrap up with a few more questions. I think this is a pretty cool one. If you had a time machine that could allow you to revisit any part of your previous life,
Hmm.
like as a third person consciousness floating around in the room, just watching you, like where and when would you go back to?
Previous life meaning a different life other than this one.
Or maybe like anything that happened in the past.
Anything that happened in the past. I mean, I don't know what I existed in as in previous lifetimes. Um, but I'd be interested to check those out. Just who was I? What did I live as? What type of person was I? What were my mistakes from previous lifetimes?
Mhm.
I'd be curious about that.
Yeah. Or I guess what about like I guess in this
This
physical life?
lifetime?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
This lifetime, um, I think the moment of birth would be interesting.
Mhm.
If I could just be a fly on the wall in the moment of my birth and the moments thereafter, really to understand the beginning. I was there, but my consciousness can't recall it.
Yeah,
So what does it look like to witness it? The moments from 0 to 5 are impacting our lives so much, and we often have no clue what
yeah,
went on in those moments.
yeah. It's fascinating how our consciousness just one day just turns on, and then we're like, oh my god, like we're existing. Like that's just one of the great life mysteries yet to be solved.
So wild. And
Yeah,
I'm witnessing a 3-year old, my or two, my friend has a 2-year old, and just to be able to watch him and witness him and be like, he has no idea that I'm with him in this moment, but it's being stored somewhere. And how fascinating is that?
yeah. Like yeah, what a beautiful gift childhood is. Yeah, I think another question that maybe related to it is like, what do you believe means to be a human?
Mm. What do I believe it means to be a human? I believe it means you get to watch a particular story that is a unique timestamp in humanity. And I believe you get to watch that story. And I believe it to be human is to experience that story of being disconnected from all that is, to eventually realize and or not realize eventually at the end of your lifetime after you die that you are connected to everything and everyone. So I think that's what it means to be human, to see the separation of it all and to live in the separation of it all, because the separation is beautiful. It's amazing that I can go to sleep and feel alone and feel isolated and feel disconnected, because then I get the experience of feeling connected and feeling from the in the contrast you feel it feels more alive. And so that's what I think it is to be human, feeling the contrast.
Oh, feeling like the disconnect and the connect.
Correct.
Mm,
Because that's what we are doing. Me and you are the same, but we've convinced ourselves we are different. And so that disconnection allows us to then feel connected.
mm. Do you believe that we can only connect after we feel the disconnect?
No, but I think it
Or
becomes more fun.
oh,
I think we're always connected and we
yeah.
will die and go back to connection and we'll feel the infinite divine love that is, and then we'll come back and be, oh, okay, well that was fun, let's feel the absence of that.
Oh, what a trip.
What a life,
Yeah,
real life.
what a life. All right, let's wrap up with one more question, which is what do you challenge more people to do?
um, to own their desires fully, to fully own the truth of what they want, even if it's shallow, even if their parent doesn't want them to do it, even if their friends say it's a stupid idea. If there's something in your heart that you really want to do it. Own your desires fully. And that's what I challenge people to do.
Awesome, man. I remember last time I asked you like what advice, and you're like, and you sent me a quote. It's like, no, it was, I think it's a Rumi quote. It's like, walk your own path because no one else is gonna walk it for you. And
Yes.
and I keep thinking about that. It's like, yeah, I can't let anyone help. Like they can walk with me, but I gotta walk it ultimately by myself. And that's just our lives. We're just walking each other home.
That's what it means to be human, is to walk one's own path.
Mm, awesome. Man, it's such an honor to have you on. Like I feel like I'm just going in full circle. I started the podcast and you're a huge inspiration, and you got me through such a dark chapter. Now, kind of I'm at the end of it, and interviewing you, it's just, dude, life is amazing. Of
I'm so grateful to hear that I played a role in your journey, and I'm so grateful for you for playing a role in mine.
course, dude. Feeling blessed today. All right.